Christine Maggiore, autora de este libro, ¿qué tal si todo lo que crees acerca del SIDA fuera falso? Gracias por recibirnos aquí en Los Ángeles. Thanks a lot for receiving us here in LA.
It's my pleasure.
Christine, what was your first contact with HIV? What is it at the school, at work, through the media? Do you remember what your initial reaction is?
Really, for a fairly well-informed person, I found that I knew very little about HIV and AIDS in a technical sense, in a comprehensive sense. I didn't really start to learn about it until I had the experience of testing HIV positive in 1992 during a routine medical exam.
On why did you decide to have the Elisa test done? What came to your mind when you learned the results of the test?
It wasn't my idea to take the test. The doctor that I was seeing said that every woman should take a test as a way to be socially responsible, like voting or recycling. It was just a way of showing that you cared about yourself. She said it was an empowering experience. And neither she nor I ever imagined that I would take the test and the results would come back positive. So she was just as shocked as I was when my results came back positive. In fact, she told me over the telephone by crying.
Telephone?
Yes, yes.
It's an incredible story.
It was very difficult because at the time I felt like my life was really great. I was running a multi-million-dollar business that I started with some business partners. I was going to school at night to get my MBA, my Master's in Business Administration. I had a very full social life. I was doing a lot of volunteer work. I felt like a really good person, a successful person. And the only thing I was missing, I thought, was the relationship with the right man and eventually a family, when all of a sudden this devastating news came to me.
Cierto mucho con ella, Gofo. And then, what made you decide to investigate HIV, and just how did you come across the medical studies done the German doctor Peter Dorsberg?
I originally, after I tested positive, after I got over some of the shock and the shame, I started working as a public educator and a speaker for several AIDS organizations. I would go out and speak at colleges and high schools and warn people of the dangers of AIDS and HIV, the importance of testing, and the effectiveness of treatment, all things that today I very much question. But then I felt like I was helping people by bringing these ideas up and offering myself as an example of a tragedy that could be prevented. And it was only after I felt that I was dying, they gave me 5 to 7 years to live, that the only thing I could do to help people was to tell my story, that I discovered the information of scientists and doctors who challenge our conventional thinking about HIV and AIDS. And I looked into this information, was very surprised to see that it was well-founded, practical, logical, and it made much more sense than what I was teaching people through my AIDS awareness talks that I was giving through the various AIDS organizations.
In a few moments, do you think your life is end? The death was inevitable, or something like that? What field a human being like you, a sensitive human being?
I believed with all my heart that I only had 5 years to live, like they told me. It was funny because in 1992, when I tested positive, they said, you test positive, that means you're going to die in 5 years, and there's no medications we can give you right now because you're too healthy. So I was left on my own to a certain extent to discover my own path. And now I'm very thankful that no one wanted to give me medications back then, because it's been almost 15 years since I tested positive. I've never taken any medications, and I've always been perfectly healthy. I would say abnormally healthy. I'm more healthy than the average person around me for my age and for just who I am. I'm very, very healthy. So I'm grateful that in 1992 no one was saying, start these drugs immediately like they do today. And I was, through my circumstances, I had time to discover information that would then guide my choices in life, which I think have been very healthy choices and have led me to where I am today. It's been almost 15 years since I was told I had 5 years to live. And so I think that I found my way by raising questions instead of just accepting what people were saying is true.
Excuse me, a personal question, Christine. How did your husband, Robin, react when he learned that you were HIV positive? How are each of you coping with this situation?
Well, I met my husband after I tested positive.
Mm-hmm.
He actually wanted to meet me. He had read my book, and he liked the picture of me on my book, and he wanted to meet me. We had some mutual friends, although we had never met each other. And so when he met me, he knew everything about me. And just to be sure, we had a long, long conversation about all of this. And it's been a conversation ever since. Our understanding, our knowledge is always evolving. We haven't made up our minds and we're firm on any position. We're always open to new information. But what we learn as we go along only confirms what we think we know about this. That is that the tests don't really test for HIV. They have no capacity to do so. They don't even test for unique or specific markers associated with HIV. The drugs have not been shown to be safe or effective, and there are no studies that show that the drugs give people good health or protect their health. They change numbers, but they don't really seem to have, according to the medical or scientific literature, any real effect on health. And we know that there are a lot of questions as to whether HIV is even capable of causing the collection of diseases known as AIDS.
And then, let me see, knowing that you were HIV positive, you decided to get pregnant and give birth not once, but twice.
Well, nature decided for me.
How did you reach that decision? Did you have any concerns about breastfeeding your babies?
Well, first of all, I didn't make a decision to become pregnant. It just happened very unexpectedly. I got pregnant for the first time ever in my life at age 40. And it was shortly after my husband and I began the intimate aspect of our relationship. And I didn't know I was pregnant for almost 3 months. I didn't feel sick or tired or anything, so I didn't notice. And so by the time I realized I was pregnant, pretty much our decision was that we were going to keep this child. And I knew what I know about science and medicine, so I felt comfortable with making the choices I made, all based on research and experience. I just worried about how the world would view our choices. And as it turned out, it was difficult for us to find a way to have our son without medical intervention that we didn't want. I did not want to take AZT or other AIDS drugs while pregnant because I felt that they could be very damaging, not only to my own health, but to that of my developing child.
And in which moment of your life and why do you decide to write What if everything you knew about AIDS was wrong? In Spanish, ¿qué tal si todo lo que crees acerca del SIDA fuera falso? Why? Me iba a decir, why tell me, why did you decide to write this book?
I've been asking questions since I first found out there was another viewpoint, another side to this discussion about HIV and AIDS. I began asking questions at the AIDS organizations I worked for, and I found that people were very reluctant, unwilling to give answers. They became angry, so I just kept asking the questions, and I started asking them in public forums. I would hold public events in Los Angeles. 200, 300 people would show up, and we would invite someone like Professor Peter Duisberg or the Nobel Prize-winning scientist Dr. Carrie Mullis, and they would ask questions. And finally, I wanted to, it was always a test. If these questions are valid, if they need to be asked, we'll know if we bring them to the attention of the public. Because if there are answers that make these questions invalid, certainly we'll hear from people who say, no, there's an answer to this question. I can explain how the tests work. I can explain why we don't have studies that show the drugs work, but I'll tell you how they work anyway. And that would never happen. So finally, one day, I was trying to write a very simple brochure that would just be a fold-in-half brochure with 10 questions and the information for people to think about, and then the book emerged. So it was quite by accident, and my involvement in this area too is quite by accident. I never intended to take an HIV test. I didn't know my results would come back positive. I thought I was going to die. It's an accident of beautiful circumstances that I found other information that I'm here. And then the book is just part of an ongoing search for understanding that I want to share with other people so they can join me in my search for answers.
And how is it that up until now no scientist has been able to explain how HIV brings about AIDS?
That's a good question. It's the answer is give us enough money and we'll figure it out one of these days. But it's been over 20 years and close to $200 billion we've spent in this country trying to find an answer to that question. And I think
a lot of money.
Yes, and a lot of time and a lot of lives. I think what we need to do is go back to the beginning, which is always very hard. It's always hard in any endeavor to say, I might have made a hasty decision. I might have made a mistake. Let's go back to the beginning and have a fresh look. But when you have tests that don't test for the virus itself, when none of the tests are validated by the direct isolation of HIV from any person, anywhere, who's ever tested positive, when you have no explanation as to how this very simple microbe can cause all kinds of diseases that are caused by something else. There's no AIDS illness that's caused by HIV. All the illnesses called AIDS are caused by something else. We only call them AIDS when they happen to someone we assume is HIV positive. For example, if you, I don't ever wish this upon you, you have lymphoma. You have lymphoma. If I have lymphoma, which is a fairly common form of cancer, that's AIDS because I've tested positive. If you have pneumonia, you have pneumonia.
Yeah.
If I get pneumonia, it's called AIDS because I've tested positive. And the illnesses called AIDS change from year to year, from country to country. And here in the United States, our definition of AIDS includes not being sick with anything at all. You simply test positive and have a laboratory marker that says your immune system is compromised as measured by numbers, which are very questionable, and that is AIDS. In Canada, our neighbor to the north, we're basically the same people with a divide between us. They don't recognize the non-illness definition of AIDS. So you can have AIDS in the United States and move to Canada and not have AIDS anymore.
Automatically.
Yeah, because that's not the definition. And in Africa, people say, oh, what's going on in Africa? A lot of poverty, a lot of disease that's been around for many, many, many decades. And we have a very loose definition of AIDS in Africa. Fever, weight loss, cough, diarrhea, and that's good enough to give you an AIDS diagnosis. That would never do here in the United States, nor would it work in Canada, nor does it work in Europe. So we have different ways of defining AIDS everywhere, and there's no universal standard for what's a positive test result. So we don't even agree from lab to lab, country to country, government agency to government agency, what testing positive is, what that looks like. We don't have any agreement.
So Christine, so you're convinced that we have been deceived all along?
I think a system came into place in a time of fear, in a time of panic, when people were desperate to understand what was taking the lives of young men in this country. And very quickly, that system of exploration came under the influence of government agencies who were headed by virologists. Virologists look for viruses. The pharmaceutical industry, their job is to sell treatments. Certain lobbying groups that wanted to make this so it could receive the most funding possible. And if it were seen as something that only happened to gay men, to drug users, to hemophiliacs, to certain immigrants in this country, it would not receive widespread funding or widespread attention. So there was actually a very purposeful campaign to portray the idea that it could happen to anyone. But we've seen over the years that's not true.
In other words, do you reject the concept of being bound to medications for life?
I question the premise upon which these medications are taken. They're taken in order to fight a virus that hasn't been shown to be there by tests that don't even claim to have that ability. So it's fighting a war without being sure the enemy's there, and you're bombing every day. You're sending in huge, powerful bombs. What are you destroying?
Are you convinced that AIDS become an extraordinarily lucrative business for pharmaceutical transnational companies, and that HIV/AIDS is nothing but a device for profit?
I think there are a lot of good intended people involved in AIDS research and AIDS work. I think, however, at the very top, a lot of this information that we're discussing today is known, and there has been an unfortunate decision to not bring this information to the attention of the public. And I think it has a lot to do with just the human tendency to find it very difficult to say, I might have made a mistake. But when it's on this level, involving so many people, so many lives, I think that people need to find the courage to look into this issue and to look past the headlines and the hype and the fear-based advertising and some of these even ridiculous campaigns where, for example, famous movie stars have their portrait taken and it says, I am African, and that's to support AIDS. Why would that? We would never tolerate that if they said, I am poor.
Yeah.
I am homeless. I am a refugee. Because we know they're not. These are some of the most richest, most powerful people in the world. How dare they say, I am African? But no one questions these things because we're so accustomed to AIDS being part of our social construct, all the political correctness. It's a taboo area to bring up, to explore other points of view. And I think that's a terrible thing. Anytime we stop conversation, we prohibit dialogue. It's dangerous. It's dangerous.
And in this point, tell me, what has www.aliveandwell.org mean to you and thousands of persons who at some point or other have visited this already controversial site?
I think for the people who visit, it means hope. Hope of exploring other points of view based in fact. Hope of finding answers to immune suppression, to help people in developing areas of the world where hunger, clean water, access to housing are the real problems that they're facing every day. I think it provides people with avenues of exploration, and when it is for people who have tested positive, I think it gives them a new chance at approaching life in a way that's healthy and very hopeful for a normal, happy future.
And what do you say to those people who see you as a dangerous criminal whose ideas and theories should be outright rejected, and who is perceived to the causing a great deal of damage to prevention campaigns and in the United States and worldwide?
Those people who say I'm dangerous, I'm a terrible person, are never available to sit down and talk like you and I. They never show up for a debate, a discussion. I've been invited to a number of universities and colleges around the country. They never show up. They don't want to meet with me in person. They'd rather call me a name from far away. And to me, that kind of behavior is very suspicious. I think when you feel that you are right and someone else is wrong, especially on a matter of great importance, you have a civic duty to show up and engage in dialogue. that establishes where the truth might lie. And these people never show up.
And what do you say to those who are convinced of your theories and now see the problem of HIV from a different perspective?
The hardest thing about testing positive and taking a different approach, an approach that embraces life and health and hope for the future, is that we're extremely outnumbered by systems that want to always tell us we're wrong, we're going to die. There are any number of organizations to support you into death and dying and accepting government help for your rent and giving you a special parking pass so you don't have to walk too far, and taking care of your medical needs, but only if you want to take these highly toxic drugs. There's not a lot of support for people who embrace life and health and hope for the future and who do not want to be guided into death by these organizations. And we sort of have to lean on each other for support, and the experts who have the courage, the doctors and the scientists and the journalists who have the courage to speak up and out about these issues.
And how do you see HIV, AIDS, dissension movements evolving in the future?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. All I can hope is that more and more people come to see that there is another side to this issue, a side that makes a lot of sense, that opens up avenues for practical and really inexpensive responses to helping people, an approach that's humanistic, and that, for example, in Africa, if we gave people clean water, helped create a continual food supply, and gave them basic medical care, if we did that village by village, city by city, nation by nation, it would change life there tremendously. It would change everything, and it wouldn't just be concentrating on those unfortunate individuals who are assumed to be or who test positive on these non-specific tests. It would help everyone. It would elevate everyone's life condition. So I think that this perspective offers avenues to assist people who truly need help in ways that help not just people who test positive or not those classified as AIDS victims, but people, entire nations.
And tell me, how do you feel now? How do you feel, you, Christine Maggiore, after more than 10 years?
It's going to be 15, in January.
1992?
Yes.
Since that first Elisa test. How are your kids doing? Your husband? How do you see your life in the years to come?
Well, first of all, it seems that you may not be aware of the fact my daughter died. Did you know that? I have 2 children. My daughter died in May of 2005. It seems that you are not aware of that. So sorry to bring this up at this moment. Yeah.
But what happened?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. My daughter had an ear infection as diagnosed by 3 separate doctors. Because I speak up on this issue publicly, I felt it was very important to always get 2 opinions on my children's health. Always have records from 2 doctors. And within the case of my daughter's ear infection, we have never in my family had a case where our children have been sick for anything longer than a day with, cold or a fever or something like that. So I took my daughter to see 3 doctors. They all agreed she had an ear infection. The last doctor to see her was Saturday, May 14th. He prescribed an antibiotic. We gave her 1 dose that evening and 2 doses the next day. And the evening of the next day, she went into cardiac arrest. And she died in front of us in our home as we were on the telephone to 911. And they came and they revived her and they brought her to a hospital. And they couldn't figure out what was wrong, but they just told us that she was dying. And she died about 4 hours later. she was referred to the LA County Coroner's Office for an autopsy because they couldn't explain by 2 chest x-rays, a CAT scan, a spinal tap, and blood work what was wrong with her. The coroner's office called us 2 days after she died and said, we're sorry, we don't know why your daughter died. We can't explain it. A week later, we called again. They said, we still can't explain it. We will release her so you can have some services. And about 2 days later, they discovered I wrote this book, and they learned about me. And then everything changed. They still didn't know why she died, but they decided that she died of AIDS. And they began to work backwards from that conclusion to try to find evidence. And that has become an incredible mess and a legal matter that has been going on now for over a year because of the assumption that if I write a book like this and I test HIV positive and I have a child who dies, it must be AIDS. But there was no physical evidence. There was no physical evidence when they did the autopsy. There was no physical evidence when they announced the findings in the autopsy 4 months after my daughter's death. There was no physical evidence when the police tried to charge me with negligent homicide in the death of my daughter.
Finally, you're convinced there is not a relation between your positive HIV and the death of the...
There's no relationship in the sense of physical evidence. When my daughter died, I was open to anything. All I could do was be a grieving parent, shocked and devastated by my daughter's death, and wait for those who we trust in public authority to tell me why my daughter died. Instead, we got a terrible judgment on me, not based on the physical evidence in my daughter's case, which turned into me being investigated as a criminal for over a year. The investigation was finally dropped, but I look at the evidence. The evidence says there was nothing in my daughter's lungs. There was no lung damage. The evidence says my daughter had a perfectly functioning immune system. There's no evidence my daughter even tested positive. And when we asked for that evidence from the coroner's office, they said, not without a subpoena. We're not going to give you that. Sorry.
And now you're especially afraid about your son?
My
Charles?
son? Yeah, my son's name is Charlie, and my husband's name is Robin. When we realized what was happening with our daughter's death, that there would be prejudice, that we would be regarded in a way different from any other person, my husband and my son went out for 3 tests. My husband, who's been with me for 10 years of normal relations, no protected sex, negative 3 times. My son, negative 3 times. My daughter, we don't know because they won't tell us. But we have a lot of questions about that.
Christine, what would you say to those who, to whom your book is dedicated, I think? Those who died without hope, and to those who will be able to live without fear in the future, what do you say to them?
I just urge people to become informed, whether they're directly affected by this or affected in the sense of this shapes our worldview, to being a taxpayer whose dollars go to support what may be very, very bad ideas. I think we all need to have a second look at this topic so we know how to best help people in our own country and other countries. You can't solve a problem until you've looked at it honestly and defined that problem honestly and forthrightly. And that's what I believe we need to do.
Christine, is there anything more that you would like to say to our viewers?
One thing that comes up with discussing the case of my daughter is something that comes up a lot. When you're HIV positive, or if someone suspects you're positive, or even if you just fit into what is known as a risk group, you're subjected to prejudice, medical prejudice. I know gay men who have gone to the hospital for something like a motorcycle accident, and they won't treat them until they take an HIV test. or they'll assume a simple problem that could happen to you or anyone you know has something to do with AIDS if they're African American or gay or look thin, or if they're a man over 40 and they're not married. There's a lot of prejudice. And when people who are positive go to the doctor for something that could happen to you, many times their doctor refuses to treat them unless they want to take all these drugs every day of their life and bomb the HIV that's supposed to be there. And even in the case of my daughter, this whole investigation was driven by prejudice. And that's something that we don't talk about in this HIV/AIDS culture. We don't talk about the prejudice that deprives people of their humanity, deprives people of the right to receive medical care, and that often criminalizes people, marginalizes people, and subjects them to treatment that no one else would receive in the same circumstances.
Christine, thank you very much, really, heart to heart, for your confidence.